In the winter of 1879, in the Mill Creek lumber district of Minnesota Territory, a falling pine log crushed Peter Solberg beneath its weight at the mill's log roller station, and his widow, Maren Solberg, was left with nothing but a homestead deed and the knowledge that winter would come again in 7 months. She was 26 years old, dark blonde hair bound in a thick braided crown, wound tight around her head in the Norwegian way, with ice blue eyes and broad, sturdy shoulders that had been shaped since childhood by the work of survival in a settled frontier. The mill foreman offered her a place at the sawdust screens, and she took it without hesitation. There was no other work for a woman alone, and there was no other way to live. The Mill Creek lumber mill was a landscape of golden mountains. Sawdust piles rose higher than the mill buildings themselves, some of them taller than 3-story houses, their slopes steep and gleaming pale yellow in the spring sun and white under snow. The logs were cross-cut, the planks were milled and squared, and the rest, the cores, the bark, the trimmings, all of it became sawdust, thousands of tons of it, mountains that grew larger every week. Workers used teams of horses to drag logs up the incline. The mill screamed and hammered day and night from April through October, and the air was thick with a gold haze that settled on the town and lay in drifts against the buildings like snow. Maren worked the screens with her bare hands, her fingers growing raw, then calloused. Her dress grew stained until it was no longer slate blue, but grimy ochre. She did not complain. She did not rest more often than the men. By mid-May, the foreman gave her the night shift, which paid an extra shilling a week. It was on a night in late May of 1880, nearly 9 months after Peter's death, that Maren discovered the secret the sawdust piles were keeping. The night was cool and the mill had shut down at 6 o'clock, and she was standing atop one of the larger piles, using a wooden fork to turn the surface dust so it would dry evenly. The pile was perhaps 4 years old, its outer 6 inches weathered and compacted, its surface gray where the weather had worked on it. Without thinking much about it, searching for something else, a piece of iron perhaps, or a nail, she plunged her bare arm deep into the pile, pushing through the surface crust. Her hand found warmth. Not the warmth of the sun on the surface, but genuine heat, the heat of something living or something still burning from the inside. She withdrew her arm in surprise, then thrust it back down into the pile, deeper this time, past her wrist, past her forearm. The sawdust there was bone-dry, feather-light, and warm against her skin. The smell was sweet and clean, with no rot, no mold, no smell of decay at all. She pulled out her arm and stood very still on top of that mountain of wood shavings, understanding something that most people would have forgotten almost immediately. She thought of her father, Olaf Halvorsen, dead now 5 years in the cholera summer. He had been a carpenter and a builder, and he had brought one book with him across the ocean in the bottom of his sea chest. It was called the Tømrermannen, the carpenter's manual, printed in Norwegian in a small format. The pages were worn from use, the binding split and stitched together with twine. Maren had the book still, sitting on a shelf in her cabin, unread for years, gathering dust. She left the sawdust pile that night and went home, making her way through the dark with her lamp swinging from her hand. The cabin was small, a single room with a loft and a stove in the corner. She took the manual from the shelf and opened it to a chapter she had never truly read. A chapter with a drawing of a house in section, its walls laid bare, showing how people in the north of Europe had built their homes to survive the cold. The chapter was titled Hus med dobbeltvegger, houses with double walls. The drawing showed a wall made of 2 rows of logs with a space between them. In the space, the manual explained, people packed moss. Dried moss was light and held air in its fibers. The double-wall house did not leak its heat. A man could keep his family warm through the winter with half the firewood that a single wall house required. Maren sat by her lamp, reading the entire chapter and studying the drawings. The text spoke of foundation stones laid 18 inches above the ground so moisture would not climb into the walls. It described precise notches cut into the logs to fit tight without gaps. It showed the roof done with 2 layers of planking and a gap between, sealed with pitch. Double floors in the same way. Every surface doubled. Every gap filled with something light that would not hold moisture. Every opening, windows and doors, fitted with double panes. She understood then what the Sawdust Mountains were trying to teach her. Sawdust was not moss, but it was better. It was drier, lighter, available in infinite quantities. If she mixed it with something alkaline and hostile to decay, she could build the house from her father's manual. She could build it on her own land, with her own hands. When winter came again, she would not burn through cord after cord of wood. She would keep warm with barely any fire. The decision was made that night, but the work did not begin immediately. There was sawmill work to be done through the spring and summer. There was the homestead to prepare. Maren was not a woman who rushed. Her mother, Astrid, had married again in the spring of 1876, taking a husband named Gunnar Falk, a man some 20 years her senior, iron-gray and rigid. Gunnar had made known his views within a week of the marriage. A woman alone would not survive. A woman alone belonged under the roof of a man who would make the proper decisions for her. He came riding to her cabin in May of 1880. He was a large man with broad shoulders and a thick, square-trimmed beard of iron-gray hair. His ice-blue eyes were the same shade as Maren's, which made the meetings between them unsettling, as though some essential similarity was arguing between the 2 hard wills that looked through that identical pale blue. Gunnar came to the cabin on a day when the weather was warm, and the first green things were breaking through the winter-killed grass. Maren was working on her fence line, using a maul to reset some posts that had heaved with the frost. She saw him coming and stood still, the maul held across her body like an ox yoke, waiting. He dismounted from his horse without greeting her and came to stand in the space where the fence was incomplete. "You cannot stay here alone," he said. These were his first words to her that spring. "You cannot manage a homestead. You cannot do the work that must be done. When the snow comes again, you will freeze. Come back to the house where Astrid is. Come back where a woman belongs." Maren did not set down the maul. "The homestead is mine," she said. "The deed is in my name. Peter left it to me. I will stay." "You are foolish," Gunnar said. "You are a woman who has lost her husband and cannot think clearly. This is no reflection on you. It is the nature of women. You need a man's judgment." "I have my own judgment," Maren said. "Then your judgment is false," Gunnar said, and he turned and rode away, his horse's hooves throwing up dust on the dry road. Through the summer of 1880, Maren felled trees. She worked alone with a cross-cut saw, wedging one handle and working the other herself. The blacksmith told her that a woman alone could not fell trees, that it would wear her out. She felled pine logs anyway. They fell toward the west. She limbed them with her axe and dragged them with a borrowed draft horse named Birger. By September, she had gathered enough logs to begin construction. The foundation was stone, laid in early May using flat stones from the creek bed set on larger stones that rested on bedrock. The foundation was 18 inches above the ground, as the Tømrermannen specified, leaving a gap underneath where air could move freely. The foundation was perhaps 20 feet on a side, large enough for a house where a woman could live with dignity. She began the inner walls in October, notching the first course of logs and setting them on the foundation. The notching was work that required precision. She marked the logs with a wooden template, using measurements from her father's manual. The notches had to fit without gaps. The logs had to sit level. She used a saw and an axe and a chisel, working slowly, one log at a time, checking with a level purchased from the trading post. The walls rose slowly through October and November. The first course took 2 weeks. By December, the walls were chest high. Snow fell and made the work harder. She did not work during heavy storms, but worked on clear, cold days. The neighbors watched and said nothing to her face, but the mockery was evident in their glances, in the way they spoke about her at the general store. In January, Gunnar brought the pastor to inspect the work. The pastor was a man named Eriksson, old, with a weathered face and compassion for his people, but he also understood tradition and hierarchy. He walked around the cabin site while Maren stood in the cold, and when he was finished, he said, "This is a fire hazard. The sawdust will catch fire and burn this house to ashes in an hour." "The sawdust is inside the walls," Maren said. "There is no fire in the walls." "But if the wood of the walls catches fire, the sawdust will burn like powder," the pastor said. "No, this is not a sound structure. I must counsel you against it. You should come live with your mother and Gunnar until you have time to marry again and have a husband to guide you in these matters." Gunnar did not speak while the pastor was there, but once the pastor had left and they were alone, Gunnar said, "She is building a house of wood shavings. It will rot before Christmas, and then she will come crawling back to my house, and I will remind her of this day. In the meantime, I will let the town watch how foolish women can be when they are left without a man's guidance." The story spread. At the general store, where the mill workers gathered on Saturday afternoons, men shook their heads and spoke of Sawdust Maren, the woman who was trying to build a cabin from the refuse of the lumber mill. It was a good story and a bad story, a story that made men feel they understood women better, which was to say that they understood women as creatures who could not be relied upon to make decisions that served their own interests. The foreman at the mill told Maren that some of the workers had made bets on when the cabin would collapse. Some said Christmas. Some said the spring thaw. No one gave it longer than a year. Maren did not respond to the mockery. She continued the work. Through the winter of 1880 and into the spring, the walls rose. In February, when the weather was bitter and the wind came from the north and seemed to go straight through flesh to bone, she was still working, her fingers wrapped in cloth, her breath frosting white in the bitter air. The inner wall was complete by April. 8 inches of notched pine logs stacked and fitted tight, rising 8 feet to where the roof would begin. Then came the outer wall. She set a new sill 8 inches outside the first wall, on the same foundation that lay 18 inches above the ground, and she began again, notching and fitting and stacking logs. But this time the work was faster because she knew the rhythm. By June, the outer wall was complete, and she had between the two walls a gap of 12 inches, an exact rectangle of empty space that was ready to receive the insulation that would hold the heat. The lime treatment came next. She went to the mill and arranged with the foreman to have sawdust delivered to a location behind her cabin. Not the fine powder that resulted from the mill screens, but the coarser chips and fragments, the material that was heavy with the texture of the wood. She obtained slaked lime, calcium hydroxide, from the trading post, a white powder that came in bags and cost more than she had expected. The lime was caustic and dry, alkaline and hostile to every rot and mold that might threaten the wood. The lime was the key to everything. She mixed the sawdust and lime in large wooden troughs made from barrel halves, working the two materials together by hand, her bare hands, until the golden sawdust took on a pale cream color and became uniform. The smell was sharp and clean and distinctly alkaline, a smell that cut through the nostrils and made her think of cleanliness and preservation. In the early mornings in July, she would work the mixture, and by mid-morning her hands would be white with lime dust, despite the water she used to rinse them. Once the mixture was ready, she began to fill the gap. She shoveled the treated sawdust from her troughs into the wall cavity, working from one end of the cabin to the other, and as she filled each section, she tamped it down with a long wooden pole, pressing it tight every 6 inches of height. The sawdust compressed but did not pack down completely, remaining light and permeable, but firm enough to hold its shape. By late July, the entire cavity was filled, a 12-inch thick band of treated sawdust encircling the cabin like a belt of protection. The roof was next. She had built a frame of pine rafters, studying the angles from her father's book, and laid the first layer of pine planking. On top, she placed battens to create a space, filled that space with treated sawdust and lime, then laid the second layer. The finished roof was 8 inches thick, and she capped it with split cedar shakes that would shed water. The floor was the same principle, but in reverse. She laid large stones to support the joists, and then pine planking, and then a gap of 6 inches packed with the sawdust and lime mixture, and then another layer of pine planking. When she walked on it, she could not hear the wood settle because the sawdust below absorbed the sound. The windows were the last major element. She had ordered 2 sheets of glass from the trading post, a great expense. She built frames of pine and fitted the first pane of glass into the frame, sealed it with putty. Then she built a second frame and fitted the second pane, leaving an air gap of approximately 2 inches between them. The panes were sealed together, and the effect when you looked through them was like looking through a dream, a slight shimmer as though the glass held something more than light. By October of 1881, the cabin was complete. It was not beautiful. It was, in fact, somewhat austere and plain, a simple rectangular structure with a gable roof and 2 windows on the south face and a door facing east. The walls were the orange-brown color of new pine that had not yet been weathered. The roof was gray-black from the cedar shakes. There was nothing ornamented about it, nothing suggesting the extraordinary engineering contained within its surfaces. Maren bought a cast-iron box stove from the trading post, a small one with a single damper and a short pipe that ran to the chimney. She tested it in October, burning 3 pieces of kindling and a short log. The heat was modest and direct. It was not the kind of massive stove that would radiate heat through a room, but a stove for cooking and supplemental heat. The first snow fell in November, and the neighbors watched. The cabin did not collapse, the sawdust did not rot. There was no visible sign of decay or failure. As November progressed into December and the weather grew colder, Maren began to fire the stove in the mornings and evenings. She would start with 2 pieces of kindling and a single log no thicker than her wrist, and she would feed the fire with great reluctance, allowing it to burn low, almost dying out, through the middle of the day. By December, when the cold was genuine, she could keep the cabin at a temperature of 58 to 62 degrees Fahrenheit with almost no wood at all. The cold was now a constant outside, the temperature dropping to 20 below zero, then to 30 below, but inside the cabin the air remained still and mild, and she could sit at her table in a light dress without any covering but a shawl, and she was warm. The winter of 1881 and 1882 was the test, and the cabin passed it completely. While other cabins in Mill Creek burned through their cords of wood by February, their chimneys billowing dense white smoke, Maren's stove drew barely a thread of smoke from the chimney. Her woodpile, which had seemed substantial in October, remained almost untouched. She burned perhaps a quarter cord of wood through the entire winter, wood that came from the trimmings and leftover pieces at the mill, wood that other people would have considered too green or too poor to burn, but which was sufficient for her purposes. The people in the town did not know what to make of this. They had expected her to fail, but she did not leave. The cabin did not fail. Each year, the same pattern repeated. While her neighbors burned 8 or 10 or sometimes 12 cords through the winter, Maren burned less than a quarter cord, and her cabin was warm. Years passed. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was cold and long, but the cabin held. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was wet and then cold, and the cabin held. Gunnar watched from across the town. He could not understand the technique, could not see how she was doing it, because the secret was in the walls themselves, in the layers that were not visible from the outside. In 1884, he filed papers with the town magistrate, claiming that Maren was unfit to live alone, and that, under the family obligation statute, she should be removed from her homestead and placed under his protection. The homestead was unsafe, he claimed. It was built in an unsound and dangerous manner. She required the oversight of a man. Maren appeared before the magistrate with her deed, and with a letter from the mill foreman and from the mill owner stating that the cabin was constructed in an exemplary manner, and that the techniques employed in its construction were sound and represented an advance in the science of building. The magistrate dismissed Gunnar's petition and advised him not to bring such claims again unless he had substantial evidence of actual danger. Gunnar withdrew to his own homestead, a mile west of Maren's cabin, and in the winters that followed, he could not help but notice that her cabin remained warm while his own, despite his constant addition of wood to the stove, remained cold. His cabin was a single wall structure, built in the conventional manner, and it leaked heat the way a sieve leaks water. In January of 1886, the cold came that would be remembered for the rest of the century, the cold that men would speak of for the rest of their lives, the cold that tested every structure and every person in Minnesota Territory to their limit. The temperature dropped on the 18th of January to 35 degrees below zero. On the 19th, it dropped to 40 below. On the 20th and 21st, it stayed at 40 below. On the 22nd, it dropped to 45 below. On the 23rd, it reached 50 degrees below zero, and on the 24th, it dropped to 52 below, where it stayed for 2 days. The cold was absolute. It was the kind of cold that made the air take on a texture, that made each breath a physical thing, that turned exposed flesh white in minutes. It was the kind of cold that made survival itself a question that had to be answered every hour. In the town of Mill Creek, the chimneys of every single wall cabin began to pour smoke almost immediately. Men and women began burning wood at a rate that had never been attempted before, burning everything that could be burned, burning old furniture and wooden tools and even dried animal dung in desperate attempts to keep the temperature inside above freezing. In Gunnar's cabin, located on a hill to the west of the town, the cold pushed in from every seam and every gap. He had a good supply of wood, nearly 6 full cords cut and stacked, an amount that he had considered more than sufficient for any winter that had ever come to Minnesota. By the 3rd day of the freeze, Gunnar had burned 3 of those cords. The cabin temperature was hovering around 30 degrees Fahrenheit inside, and his breath frosted on the inside surfaces of the walls. Ice formed in the morning on the inside of his windows. He had taken to remaining in the kitchen near the stove and piling blankets on top of himself to stay warm. His water bucket, kept beside the stove, was developing a skim of ice on its surface each morning. In Maren's cabin, the cold outside was the same 52 degrees below zero, but inside, the double walls and layers of treated sawdust held the heat with a constancy that seemed almost miraculous. She woke in the morning and lit a fire with 2 pieces of kindling and 1 short log, and by midday the cabin had warmed to 58 degrees. The walls themselves seemed to be holding the heat, radiating it gently into the space. On the 3rd day of the freeze, when the temperature outside had reached 50 degrees below zero, people began to arrive at her door. They came from cabins that had become too cold to occupy, families huddled in coats and blankets. An old man named Svensson came, and his wife and 3 adult neighbors. By the 4th day, there were perhaps 20 people sheltering in the cabin, sitting on the floor, on the bed, pressed together for warmth. But the warmth in the cabin was not coming from their bodies or from any gathering of heat. It was coming from the walls. People would touch the interior surfaces of the walls and feel the gentle warmth radiating from the pine planking, and they could not understand where it was coming from. The stove was barely lit. There was no visible fire. Yet the cabin was warm. On the 5th day of the freeze, when the temperature outside had settled at approximately 50 degrees below zero and had been there long enough that ice was building up on the outside of the windows in thick layers and the very air seemed to have turned to crystal, Gunnar Falk arrived at Maren's door. He came on foot, walking the mile from his homestead, though walking in that cold was an act of genuine bravery or desperation, or both. His dark brown wool coat was white with frost and ice crystals, crusted and stiffened. The brass buckle on his belt was so cold it would have burned his bare skin if he had touched it. His fur-lined cap was pulled low over his ears, and his iron-gray beard was thick with ice. His nose and the parts of his face that were exposed were the color of old ash, the pale gray white of skin that is burning with cold. Maren saw him coming and opened the door before he could knock. The blast of warmth from the cabin met him in the threshold, and for a moment he simply stood there, unable to step forward, his body processing the shock of the temperature change. "Come in, Gunnar," she said. "The walls are warm." He stepped inside, and she closed the door behind him. The warmth was not blazing or obvious. It was simply there, a constant gentle heat that seemed to come from the surfaces themselves. He stood in the center of the room, with people pressed all around him. He recognized some of them, neighbors, people from the town, and slowly he began to understand what she had built. He removed his cap, holding it in both hands, the ice and frost on it already beginning to melt and drip on the wooden floor. His ice-blue eyes, the same shade as hers, the same pale Arctic blue that seemed to see through to the bone, met hers across the small room. He looked at the walls, at the windows that remained clear and unfrosted while the outside world was building layers of ice. He looked at the small stove with its barely visible flame, burning a tiny amount of wood and yet keeping the cabin at a temperature where human beings could survive and even find comfort. He looked at his stepdaughter, Maren standing in her slate blue dress and her cream-colored shawl with its Norwegian geometric pattern, and he understood that she had exceeded him in every way that mattered. "The walls," he said, and his voice was rough from the cold. "How did you know? How did you understand this?" "My father," Maren said. "He left me a book." Gunnar looked around the cabin, at the people sheltering there, at the warmth that was so palpable it seemed almost visible. And he said nothing more. He sat down on the floor with the others, his back against the warm wall, and he remained there for the next 3 days, through the end of the freeze, watching the cabin hold its warmth while the outside world remained locked in the deepest cold that Minnesota Territory had ever recorded. When the freeze ended on the 26th of January and the temperature began to climb back toward the realm of merely dangerous cold, Gunnar stood and put on his cap, and he walked back to his own homestead without speaking to Maren. But a week later, at the town meeting, he stood before Pastor Eriksson and the gathered people of Mill Creek and said, "My stepdaughter has built a house better than any man I have known, and that is a statement of fact, and I say it includes myself in that judgment. What she has done is not foolishness. It is engineering. It is the future of how we will live in this country." Pastor Eriksson asked Maren if she would teach others the technique. She said that she would, and over the next year, 3 other cabins were built using the double wall and sawdust insulation method. One was built for an old widow named Ingrid. One was built for Lars Hansen, the man who had loaned her the horse, and one was built for a young couple from back east who had come to Minnesota and found that the winters were harsher than anyone had warned them. In the summers that followed, Maren continued her work at the mill, and in the winters, the cabin that she had built held warm and firm, and she would sit at her table with a book open before her, often her father's Tømrermannen, and she would read or simply look out the double-paned windows at the frozen landscape beyond, knowing that the walls around her would hold against any cold that came. By the summer of 1886, 5 winters after the first freeze, the sawdust that had been packed into the walls between the double logs had not rotted. It had not molded. No rats or mice had nested in it. The lime had done its work perfectly, preserving everything, making the walls impervious to the decay that would have ruined a conventional structure. The double roof and the double floor were equally sound. The cabin had become a monument, not to foolishness, but to patience and understanding, to the application of knowledge from one place to solve problems in another place, to the power of taking seriously the gift of a dead father's book. The mill continued to produce its mountains of sawdust, the piles growing larger and more golden in the summer sun, steaming in the cool mornings when the night frost was still retreating. The town grew around the mill, more cabins, more people, more families arriving to seek their fortune in the lumber business. And every winter, when the snow came and the cold descended, Maren's cabin stood warm and silent, asking nothing of the forests that surrounded it except the sawdust that would have been burned or buried anyway, asking nothing of the winter except that it remain winter. And it did.